figured it out. I figured it out from black and white.
So George Stavros, as His Eminence said, needs no introduction. He's one of us, a graduate of our school, a good friend to all of us. He is an incredibly important support system for our metropolis and for this camp. All the ministries we run at this camp, especially the youth summer camp program, as you know, we encounter many struggles and issues, and George is one of our first call immediate crisis management. So for that, George, on behalf of His Eminence and all of us, we say thank you. George has two presentations that's entitled 10 Things That I Wish I Learned at Seminary. As you know, he's the director of the Danielson Institute at Boston University, where most of us, or many of us, went for psychological interviews, and he offers incredible support to our clergy and to the ministry. So George, on behalf of His Eminence, thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Father Ted. It's a privilege to be invited in, and hopefully I can provide you with a few words, things that I thought about under the banner of things I wish I'd learned at seminary. These are things that you'll probably notice have a little bit of a social science or shrinky flavor to them, just because that's the journey that I've taken. Hopefully they'll resonate with our Orthodox theology and be things that make some sense in terms of your pastoral ministry and your own personal well-being and attempts to take good care of yourselves so that you can do the hard work of taking care of all those who are in your flocks. The first part of this, probably the first talk, will be a little bit on the crucifixion, brokenness, fallenness side of things, which psychology has a wide vocabulary for talking about and describing the ways in which human beings break and are injured. The second part will emphasize a little bit more the resurrection side, the healing side, the repair side of things. But anything that I would hope to carry some Orthodox flavor, there will be interspersing of each, some paradoxical connections that go with those. All right, so to begin with, I want to go back to seminary. And when I first got to seminary, having come from a sports administration background, I had actually been working at a place in Houston called the Summit, which is an old sports arena. It is now the cathedral for Joel Osteen. So the Summit took a sports to religion track, much like myself. I don't want to take any credit for that, but my own track was sports to religion, and so I was very new to so many ideas about Orthodoxy. I'd grown up at St. Demetrius Church in Hammond, Indiana. I loved the liturgy, I loved playing basketball, I loved my friends there, but I never really got deeply into what it meant to be Orthodox other than to live it through the life of the parish, which I wouldn't underestimate. But one of the first things I came across at seminary was the little book. At the time it was a black book with red letters that many of you may have seen too, called The Orthodox Way. And it was written by, at the time, Bishop Kallistos Ware, now Metropolitan Ware. And this book meant a lot to me. Back when I was in seminary, Halki Village wasn't married student housing, so there were graduate students up there. And of course, as some of you may remember, we would have interesting discussions with each other. In one case, trying to come up with metaphors for the Holy Trinity. And, one of us would say, it's like the three phases of water: ice, steam, and liquid. And then, another one of us would say, well, no, it's like Freud's three parts of the person: the id, the ego, and the superego. And we'd be having these attempts at deep conversation. But then, in the Orthodox Way, I came across Bishop Ware's description of what the Trinity implicated. Not so much what it was, but what it meant. That God was three in one, three persons in one God, living in loving connection to one another. I just want to share a quote that has stayed with me. We're probably talking 30 years now since I was at seminary. Because we know that God is three in one, each of us is committed to living sacrificially in and for the other. Each is committed irrevocably to a life of practical service, of active compassion. Our faith in the Trinity puts us under an obligation to struggle at every level, from the strictly personal to the highly organized, against all forms of oppression, injustice, and exploitation. In our combat for social righteousness and human rights, we are acting specifically in the name of the Holy Trinity. Now, for the first time, I felt like I had found some direction in my life. And I didn't know how I would serve, but now I knew that because God is three in one, it meant that to serve meant to be fully alive and fully human. And that was incredibly good news at the time. So, the track that I took, with the blessing of His Eminence, some of my professors, Father Nick, Cremidas, who encouraged me, it was to go on and to study in the social sciences and to get a degree in pastoral psychology. And so those are going to be some of the insights that I share. But as I went into that field, I remember leaving the seminary in August 1991. Father Kalivas was standing in the driveway as I was driving out with my stuff, getting ready to start my first semester at BU. And he put his head in the window and he said, "Don't lose your faith." And I said, I didn't actually know what he meant at the time. But what I want to say is, the journey for me feels like, through some of the stories that I'm going to share today about the people that I've worked with, it's been to have the faith that I began learning about at the seminary confirmed, to come to see how much sense our faith makes in the healingness of broken people. All right, so because relationships are important, that's number one lesson at seminary. As a social scientist, it made me want to learn about how psychologists think about relationships. And at the Danielson Institute, we're working hard to develop a relational spirituality. And while there are many choices in the psychology theory world, we've landed with three that we're working with in particular. And I'm not going to do a big psychology lesson, but I'm going to tell you what they are. The first one is called attachment theory. Attachment theory is a theory of development from infancy, even prenatal development, all the way through the end of life. It's a developmental theory that insists that people are social beings. They are relational beings from the very beginning of life. And apart from what attachment theorists would call relational security or attuned relationality, human development has a very hard time taking hold and getting traction. So the earliest experiences of the human infant and child, inasmuch as they are relationally secure, they make it possible for development to take place, and not development only to be relationally secure. As a matter of fact, it's quite different. It's additive. Human development is meant to be full of relational security so that we can explore, so that we can get out of ourselves, so that we can reach out and understand and relate to people who are different from us. So attachment theory is relational security begets exploration. The second theory that we use is called family systems theory. Family systems theory is something that takes very seriously that we live within interconnected webs of each other. Sometimes they're called parallel processes. So that a person is not an individual, a person is a person embedded in a context. a family context, a community context, a faith community context, a cultural context, a national context, a global context. I think Orthodox anthropology would say a cosmic context. And all those levels are connected so that anything that happens at any one of those levels has an impact at every other level in some way. And the reason this is important to consider in the brokenness and healing of people is that in our families, as part of that development, as part of that attachment, things are happening all the time. And so in order to understand ourselves and in order to understand others, we need to account in some ways for what has been a person's life in the contexts in which they've grown. The third one is called, this one's a long title, Contemporary Psychoanalytic Relational Theory. Now, there's the old school psychoanalysis, which is the earliest writings of Freud. He actually progressed, by the way. He didn't just get stuck in the idea that people are driven by instincts only. That would be very incomplete. But contemporary relational psychoanalytic theory, I call it, it's the psychology of the human relational heart. It's understanding ways in which our experiences affect the way that we are waiting for something to happen in relationships, the way we anticipate something is going to happen. If our history is full of relative relational security and acceptance and attunement, our very brains and nervous systems are primed to walk into a situation expecting that things are going to go basically well. And our alarm systems are well tuned to differentiate between something that's novel and something that's dangerous. If early life has been more disruptive, full of unexpected loss or trauma or abuse, our brains and our nervous systems are primed to have a very quick alarm system. And our capacity to differentiate between what's novel and what's dangerous is limited. We're going to fall on the side of dangerous almost all the time because that's what our alarm system is designed to do. Alarm systems don't differentiate. If the alarm gets tripped, it goes off full alarm all the time. So this, as you might be able to tell, is leading to the second thing I wish I had learned more about in seminary, and that's trauma. I've made some adjustments on the details of some of these clinical examples that I'm going to give so that there's no way to, not that any of you would know people that I see, but there's no way to connect the identities of those people, just so you know. There are ways in which people who experience, and we all have some element of this because it's part of being human, there are ways in which people with a trauma history respond in the face of their nervous system's alarm. Some of these you've heard of, I'm sure. Fight, flight, freeze, and appease. Those are 4 responses to trauma. Fight, flight, freeze, and appease. Fight is pretty self-explanatory. You have to go after the threat in order to protect yourself. Flight is to avoid it, run away from it. Freeze is to become numb or dissociate, for the nervous system to send signals that we shut down. And to appease is to try to somehow appease the threat so that it doesn't become any more of a threat. As caregivers, my guess is each of you have spent many hours counseling people where you are hearing stories that are very intense and maybe full of trauma. And my guess is, in doing that, you find yourselves getting pulled into their stories at times, or feeling a certain way, like, oh, I don't want to listen to this anymore, or getting distracted, or identifying with it, or getting anxious, or feeling sad with them. Back to attachment. This is attunement. You're providing, in doing that, in letting yourself be affected enough to feel, to have empathy and compassion, what the attachment theorists would say is you're providing something to help contain their terror. What we're trained to do as therapists is, even if we have a thought that doesn't connect directly to what it is we're talking about with our patients, we're trained to say, what might that thought have to do with this person that I'm sitting with? So in knowing a little bit more about trauma and the relational transmission of trauma, we can understand our own reactions when we're working with somebody that has experienced trauma and try to provide them with containment and compassion. Another part of trauma that is important to consider is the intense experience of shame that often goes along with experiences of trauma. Those of us who have experienced some kind of physical or emotional or sexual or spiritual or natural disaster trauma often carry with us an intense level of shame about the experience. And we wonder why that is. So when children are usually 8, 9 years old or less, they live in what's called an egocentric world. To live in an egocentric world means you kind of think that anything that happens has something to do with you. Injury, being hurt by someone, then gets translated into what? Was it my fault? Did I do something wrong? I'll never forget the story a colleague of mine told me about when she was getting ready to remarry after she had been divorced. And her 8-year-old daughter, after she and her soon-to-be husband told her daughter that they were going to get married, went and climbed a tree 20 feet up and would not come down. And she tried everything. My colleague tried everything to get her to come down. She would not come down. And so my colleague just went and sat on the wall underneath the tree for an hour. Finally, her daughter came down, sat next to her, and my colleague went to put her arm around her, and her daughter said, "Don't touch me." So my colleague just backed off. They sat together for another 20 minutes, not saying anything. Finally, this little 8-year-old turns to her and says, "Was it my fault? Was it my fault?" Now, that's not just about being 8 or 9 years old or less. That's about trauma. Because what happens in trauma is physiologically, there's a brain process, there's a full body process that happens. Trauma triggers alarm. Alarm triggers body changes in order to prepare for fight, flight, freeze, appease. Blood flow leaves our fingertips, leaves our toes, and goes into our large muscles of our hips, our shoulders, and squeezes out of the front of our brain and goes down into the deeper lizard brain, the part that controls automatic movement. And when that happens, we can't feel the world the way that we usually feel it. We can't feel our feet underneath us the way we usually feel them on solid ground. And the part of our brains that make meaning, that teach us why one thing happens, how we can organize ideas, how we can make right sense of things. The part of our brain God gave us, bigger than any other mammal, to make sense of things, shuts down, and what we're left with is, within trauma, an egocentricity. So that anybody who gets hurt very badly, along with some capacity to take a step back and say what happened or why it happened, almost always it leaves behind a piece of us that asks the same question as the 8-year-old on the stone wall. Anybody who's ever been in a car accident or who has been accosted by someone, beaten by someone, or been severely mistreated in some way, has the inescapable question of, was it my fault? How many of my clients who have experienced trauma wrestle with that question? Could I have done something differently? So, it's just something to keep in mind. Anytime somebody is with you and that's the question, it's understandable. The hallmark behavior that goes with shame is avoidance. It's pulling away. It's just wanting to get away, wanting less and less contact with oneself and with others. The guilt doesn't necessarily carry that with it. It can, but it doesn't carry the same biological, behavioral push towards avoidance. Guilt can be a teacher, whereas shame runs the risk of creating avoidance. The identity of a guilty person is much more easily, I have done something wrong, which creates options about what to do about that. The identity issue around shame is, I am wrong. I am the cause, who I am, not what I did. And that's much more difficult to bounce back from. Many people who are part of a trauma that involves other people faring worse than they did for no good reason. They survived a car crash, a house burned down and they're the one that got out, things like that. It's a hybrid because the trauma creates the feeling of shame. There's no reason for them to feel ashamed, but the trauma itself, the horror, affects our brain and our bodies in such a way that shame is inescapable. So there's an identity piece to it, but it's called survivor's guilt, not survival shame, because there's also this, there are a lot of questions that person often has about what they could have done differently. So they may not even be saying so much, it's because of me that this happened. They might be saying it's because of what I did or didn't do. But it's still very debilitating. Shame is the emotional experience that one is internally flawed. And because of the internal flaw, one becomes unacceptable to others, to contact with others, to loving contact. And without that contact and the avoidance of contact both with others and with healthy rhythms of life, shame sets off a cascade of potential isolation, furthering emotional dysregulation, and just a deprivation of the kind of relational resources a person needs to live a healthy life. And shame can be related to a single event, but it can also be related to chronic trauma. It can be related to severe loss. There often isn't a moral component to what's triggering the shame. Guilt tends to be more about single events or related events and one's responsibility in doing harm through behavior. So it's less tied to one's deep identity, it's more tied to one's actions and assessment of those actions in relation to others. Typically, it's much less debilitating, and the road back to human contact from guilt is clearer than it is with shame. The next one is, I wish I'd learned more about addiction. Several years ago, a client that I was working with who was abusing multiple substances, sometimes cocaine, sometimes marijuana, a lot of alcohol. Finally, it got him into so much trouble that he had to go to a detox, 30-day rehab, and then back into outpatient psychotherapy where he returned to working with me. And I'll never forget the first day that we sat down together, and we sat down, and he looked physically better, so I was kind of expecting, this was going to be a triumph of his work in getting himself clean. He sat down, and I said, "Hey, it's good to see you. How are you doing?" And he couldn't even get a word out. He just started to sob. Took about a minute before he could stop, and I was a little surprised because of how good he looked coming in. And I'm not saying this this sobbing was not good. It was good, but it was just so different than what his carriage was coming in. Finally, after that minute, he wiped his tears and he said, "I am so lonely." I'll never forget those 4 words. I am so lonely. So one of the things I wish I had learned more about in seminary was that addictive or compulsive behaviors, whether it's drinking or other substances or gambling or pornography or online gaming or internet, anything that a person goes to and goes to and goes to and can't step back from, more often than not, it's a painkiller. Let me say that one more time, although I think you probably all got it. Addictive, compulsive behaviors that a person returns to and returns to and returns to, more often than not, is to kill some kind of pain. And the most likely pain it's trying to kill is a relational pain. It's the pain of relational rupture, either through trauma or loss, being injured or having injured. My guess is in your ministries, you're seeing it more and more. My guess is in the United States and in much of the Western world, we haven't even seen the tip of the iceberg yet on this. And my guess that has something to do with healing relationships being less and less available. Addiction is driven by emotional pain caused by broken relationships. Most of the time, not all the time. And some people are more susceptible. Their body chemistry, their brain chemistry just locks into one kind of behavior or substance in a way that it feels like they've been released from hell for about 13 minutes. And then they have to come back and get it again. One of the difficult parts of being in mental health is many people come for treatment because their level of emotional pain and self-hatred translates into them wanting to kill themselves, having feelings or thoughts of wanting to kill themselves. Thank God most people don't. Thank God. Otherwise, I think it'd be a very hard thing to keep doing for any length of time. But a client that I worked with for several years who fought a battle with heroin and really got her life right again. Was in a relationship, was working, was getting more and more solidly on her feet. Her relationship ended. She broke up with her partner. And it started her back on a spiral of addiction. And I remember the helplessness of seeing her start using again, start showing up at sessions, looking pretty raggedy from the previous few days, then missing sessions, then not answering phone calls. And eventually, I heard from her family that she had overdosed and that we had lost her. So it was one of the most helpless feelings I've ever had. So I think another thing about addiction that I want to share is that its grip can be incredibly tight, even in the lives of people who are getting some traction. We can never take for granted if somebody is deep into addiction and is on the road to recovery, that it's a done deal. It's a piece of work that they have to do. I think there's so much wisdom in the 12 steps. It's something that they have to work one day at a time, and to work one day at a time within a community of relationships. Remember, relational security, going back to attachment, begets exploration. And to be caught up in the outcome as caregivers is to guarantee that we will be disappointed when it comes to very powerful addictions. To be too connected to outcomes is almost a guarantee for disappointment. what I would encourage each of us to do, because it's something that I face as a clinician as well, wishing that the addiction would release that person. I remember one of my favorite depictions of addiction is in the TV show called The Wire. It's about policemen in Baltimore. And they're showing a 12-step meeting. And this man who's been in recovery for a long time said, "My disease is waiting right outside the door in the parking lot, doing push-ups, just waiting for me to come back out." And that's a great description of the way a relationship develops between a person and a substance in the absence of person-to-person connection. So we have a role, even if it's to be wisely moderating our level of involvement. The worst thing we can do in relation to addiction is cut the cord and abandon. It's better to set up really tough rules of engagement and stay connected than it is to cut the cord and abandon. Often it's difficult because clergy are the frontline mental health providers for 85% of people seeking help. And for about 60%, the only person somebody will seek for help. But spiritual support is trying to wisely open up that group that a person is getting help from. It's trying to connect them. If outcome is, do they now have at least one other person that they're getting help from besides me? That's a spiritual victory. It's a victory across the board. So make that one of the metrics that you don't get. None of us tries alone to take on what's going on with somebody. And what we are tending to find now, I think the best treatment results come when treatment is looked at as something in episodes. We're not going to focus on the behavior of the addiction right now. We're going to try and get you surrounded with relationships, try to rebuild those. What has to be discerned, though, in that process of creating treatment plan and treatment goals is to what extent is the behavior of the addiction compromising that person's capacity to be in relationship with others or their very own capacity to function in any way, vocationally or relationally. I would consider it a small victory now that she's got it in her mind when she's coming to talk to you. Oh God, he's going to ask me if I'm going to therapy again. That's getting a little traction, and to the degree that you can be playful with that as opposed to shaming with that. To say, you know and I know and you know that I know that I'm going to ask you about therapy, and not have it compromise your availability to her, and yet do not let go of it. Because it can often take many, many passes before somebody actually gets up the courage to do that. Another thing that I wish I'd learned more about in seminary is sex. Let me give you a couple of examples. Client that I had seen for a couple of years, a young woman, intelligent, articulate, faithful, employed, but with a pretty disrupted early attachment history. A lot of neglect, abandonment, abuse. In a way, it put her in a very ambivalent place. She had very mixed feelings about even having a body. To look at her, you wouldn't know. To sit and talk with her, you would come to understand. Over the past several months, she had had some sexual encounters with men that she didn't know. She had had unprotected sex with them. And when she came in to talk about it, she talked about it with almost no emotion, without any kind of regret, sadness, curiosity, interest. It's just almost like she was shut down. And so I just noticed that. You know, it's one of the things that we can do in terms of difficult therapeutic conversations is not try and ask something brilliant. Just notice what it is we're noticing and say something. So in this case, I said something like, you know, you're describing these things to me that I listen to them and I'm worried for you and I feel upset about this, but it doesn't come across in the way you're describing it like you're registering that it's upsetting. And she took a small breath, but it wasn't like she then tapped into all this emotion. And I'll never forget, she said, "Dr. Stavros, I don't think I'm going to live that much longer anyway." And my heart skipped a beat because I'm thinking, oh my God, is she suicidal? And so I didn't go right to that question, but now I've got it in the back of my mind, is she in danger? Turned out, from the perspective of immediately taking her life, she was not at all in danger. But here's what she went on to say. "I don't get anything from these encounters. As a matter of fact, it doesn't even feel like I'm there in some ways. But here it is again. I am so lonely that I figure at least I get a little attention before we have sex. And that's, you know what, that's better than nothing." And, you know, we talked about it. We talked about the importance of safe sex, that in some way she was endangering her life by having unprotected sex. But the idea that people have sex for reasons that aren't really sexual is really important. That sex is similar to breathing, and it's a very natural function. It's something, you know, God has created us with to be able to, and other mammals, to populate the earth. Something God has given to us in such a way that it can be extremely pleasurable. It can be a great enhancer of intimacy between a husband and a wife, that it's life-giving. Yeah, that's all true. But it's different from breathing, too. Breathing, if we stop breathing, we're done. Sex carries with it powerful physical and emotional and spiritual capacities to try to solve some problem other than just relieving a sexual urge. Loneliness is a big one. Recreation of trauma is another. What I mean by that is, have you heard the expression of moth to flame? So many times, people who've suffered some kind of particularly sexual abuse early in life will seek out relationships later on that are almost like do-overs. And I've heard this described by patients in many different ways. One woman that I worked with said, I remember she suffered a date rape in college. And then after that, her next year in college, she had a series of sexual encounters. And after each one, she would steal something from the guy's room. And I was like, why are you doing that? Not like that. I was more attuned. And she said, because then I'm in control. I'm in control. Now, one sees the brokenness in that. At the time and to this day, I didn't and don't think somehow me taking a moral stance of you shouldn't do that was going to change anything. In fact, it might have ended the therapeutic relationship. Instead, I tried to take a position of, that makes sense. I think I get it. Can you tell me a little bit more about why being in control is so important? So we try to open things up. And when it comes to sex, religious people, we get anxious. We don't want to open it up. We want to close it down. Our kids become teenagers and young adults. We don't want to think about them having sex. We want them to be pure. Not want to touch anybody or be touched by anybody. But that's not how it works. And where the life is in this is in opening up space to understand how sexual life has the possibility of being so life-giving, but how it also can be used to try to solve problems or address pains or take control in ways that if we understood it, somebody might have other options than using sex to do those things. Because actually, sex is not a good solution to being lonely. Sex is not a good solution to being in control. It's not. It's good. It's good for what it's good for, to be a life-giving part of connecting. But other than that, we want to give people options. And we'll rarely give people options if all we do is say, you can't do that one. We give people options by saying, well, why that one? What else you got? What are the other possibilities? If we're just going with basics, that we are relational, created in the image and likeness of a relational Trinitarian God, and so we can't help but yearn for relationship with God and with others. And maybe in a fallen world or something, that's impossible to do ever perfectly. So we are set up to feel lonely and empty. I think that's probably true. In a counseling setting, it would take a long time to get there. But a secular counseling setting, it might be easier in a pastoral counseling setting to get there. I think from the pulpit, that plays. I think that'll preach in a pulpit. Because then you're not personalizing it to anybody, but you're putting out there the things that we do as people is we're trying to fill a hole we can't fill and name some of the things that we do. I think that can at least establish a culture of thinking about our longing to fill up the holes in us and ways in which a rhythmic, balanced, relational life in church community can help hold us as we try and fill that and not do it in destructive or self-destructive ways. Open it up. That's another one of those things. When I was talking about sex, I was talking about sexual expression of any kind. Instead of saying, the church says you can't do that. You have to create relational security before you can explore. And to understand anybody's sexual behavior, you have to explore. So if he's in dialogue with you, I would try and open up space and tell me about your life. Tell me how this works. Tell me, show me, explain to me what this is. And, along the way, you have to decide as pastoral caregivers where to intervene and how around the behavior. But that's the case whether it's a homosexual behavior or activity or identity or anything else that somebody's coming to you and saying, I'm doing this and I'm not sure about it. Open it up. We're going to talk about humility in the second half. That's part of being humble is saying, just because somebody says they're gay or they're depressed or they're suicidal or they're addicted, these are words that have so much possibility of meaning. And I know you all are so busy. It's like, you can't, just mobilizing yourself to have one deep held conversation is a triumph. But that's what we're talking about. The social science research suggests very strongly that relationally secure therapeutic environments that open up space help people come to a place where they find the health in them through an exploration. Very little changes for any amount of time based on being told what to do. Very little. I'm going to quote one of my favorite Orthodox theologians, contemporary, Father Hopko, who said that all sexuality is fallen. So there's always something else besides one's biology. And as a therapist, I'm not there to declare what's the right way to be, because there is no pure heterosexuality, there is no pure homosexuality, there's no pure sexual expression. From a therapist's point of view, what we're trying to do is be good stewards of a space within which people feel relationally secure enough to explore their world, their behavior, their relationships, and find their way to the light. Ideally, it's a process that aids in their movement towards God somehow. It's not necessarily, it's rarely explicitly theological, but I would say there's something very important for any of us to be able, within a place where there's suspended judgment, to start to figure some things out. And sexuality is no different. If it makes sense in the way that you encounter people who identify themselves as either not sure or as explicitly lesbian or gay or bisexual or transgender, if there's a space to say something like, I don't know how this is all going to play out over time for you, but let's try and maintain our relationship and make the church a resource for your life, for your healing, especially if it's people who've been part of the church already. Try to hold on to them. Again, give up on the outcome, temporarily at least. Give up the outcome that you have to make somebody declare something that they can't or won't. Do what you're best at maintaining a relationship and offering the healing sacraments and teaching and relational parts of the church. I think it's good if you can give someone who's suffering from more than sadness some space with their family to help them get help, create space with the family so that they're not hounding that person. I would say that some of the most interesting research going on at BU in the Center for Anxiety-Related Disorders has to do with how there is a common pathway physiologically for depression and anxiety. And they call it emotional dysregulation. And it runs deeper, and again, it's got a very relational, trauma-based understanding that when people experience relational trauma, the cascade of things, the stress hormones in the body that get released take a toll on a person physiologically and takes a toll on their very way of seeing the world, their soul. Their nous gets separated from their heart, if you want to use the language of some of the Orthodox spiritual tradition. And that can happen quickly. And it takes it can take a long time to heal it, to bring the nous back to the heart. The short answer is just buying somebody some time to get help and not be told just get over it or shake it off is a hugely important role I think all of you can play. The fifth thing that I wish I'd learned more about at seminary is power. In Western countries, and the United States is maybe the significant example of this, the world, from a power standpoint, has been tilted in the direction of men with white skin who already have power. Now there's kind of a canon developing around that, and a lot of things like people working with the politics of identity, a lot of diversity initiatives in schools and in businesses and in churches, a lot of attempts to address racism and the history of racism. But if there's a force that has tilted the world in the direction of white men with power, Take St. Paul, for example. So it's not just a new thing. If he hadn't been a Roman citizen and a Pharisee, you think he would have lasted to write one epistle? I know he got a bad deal in the end, but could he have ever even had his voice heard if he hadn't had the privilege of being a Pharisee and a Roman citizen? Now, we could say, though, that St. Paul was a great steward of his privilege. He didn't use it to take power over other people. Well, maybe he did in some instances, but he also used it to spread the gospel throughout that part of the world. So I don't know how much you all are encountering this as part of your ministry. I know working at Boston University, being the executive director of a community mental health center with a very diverse clientele and diverse staff, it's always on the table of how to be a good steward of whatever privilege anybody has. But if the world's tilted towards white men with power, the downside of that is, from a relational perspective, white men with power often lose because they're fighting to hold on to power, more so than to stay connected. I think there's a reason why Christianity often thrives in the face of threat and of enemies and of persecution. It forces us to realize how dependent and relational and powerless we actually are. We don't get it in our head that, oh, we can take care of this. I can be clever enough and summon enough power and be politically wise enough and make enough good moves to protect myself. That's a recipe for disaster because eventually it's going to end. But a world tilted towards white men with power tends to hint to us that maybe we can. So I think to the degree that men, any men, can be inspired to be good stewards of their privilege, the privilege of leadership, which I'm sure many of you sometimes say, this is privilege. But it is. It's a tremendous amount of exousia in the communities. To the extent that we can be good stewards of that, as long as it's within our purview to have, it's going to make a big difference. I think of one of the greatest blessings being that I've always been part of a training community. When I was in training, I was part of a training community. When I started to work as a licensed clinician, I was part of a small clinic that worked as a team with very difficult patients. When I came to the Danielson, we had a clinical team and a clinical staff that worked together towards a shared mission. So I've never been without that, and I can't imagine trying to do much without it. Now, when it comes to your question, I couldn't even fathom the question that you asked, apart from my sense that it would never be a question I would answer on my own. I would be talking with my colleagues, with special consultants if I needed to, with that person about that dilemma of how much do we keep doing this, with people in that person's world. It would be a systemic decision. It wouldn't be my decision. To the extent that that's something that you all can do with and for each other, to develop the relationships that you have with each other so that you don't get caught with your hardest decisions alone. We put it up on the wall at the Danielson Institute, never worry alone. Because the hardest decisions oftentimes can be the most isolating. They can also be the most fruitful if we are connected with others and approach it from a systemic perspective.
I figured it out. I figured it out